Does the scientific enterprise have an unscientific assumption of space?
I suppose it does.
Richard Dawkins and Jordan Peterson recently sat down for a conversation, and Richard Dawkins makes a stunning admission about what's at bottom of his epistemology or his way of knowing. Now, these guys probably need no introduction for most, but it's worth noticing that they actually have quite a lot in common. They both are legitimate scholars in their respective fields, biology for Dawkins and clinical psychology for Peterson, both with prestigious credentials. Dawkins spent most of his career at Oxford, whereas Peterson, spent time at Harvard, taught at Harvard, and then also taught at the University of Toronto. And they both have plenty of scholarly publications. But what's perhaps most interesting is that they both, later in life, have come to secure superstar status, or a kind of celebrity status in today's culture. That's not exactly the typical career path for most academics, right? They sell a lot of books, they fill large venues for their events, and both have something of a cult-like following in terms of their fans. Now, Dawkins is a bit older. I think he's about 20 years older than Peterson, has been in the spotlight for longer. Peterson is probably more popular today. Dawkins, my sense at least, is that he's kind of in the twilight of his career, but he's still beloved by many, and it's clear in this video he's not slowed down at all. Despite these similarities, these guys are very much aimed in different directions, which is a point that's made very clear and very obvious in the video. Indeed, Richard Dawkins is still the most famous living atheist, and for some, he made atheism cool. In fact, his book, The God Delusion, really catapulted this so-called new atheist movement. There was really nothing new about new atheism. It just refused to take any religious talk or talk of the supernatural as a legitimate option for how to think of the world. This, to my mind, is the legacy of Richard Dawkins. For Dawkins, any reference to God or anything beyond the natural world is seen as nonsense, or worse, even delusional.
I mean, there are all sorts of illusions that the human brain is very capable of creating. And
that's an illusion. Those people,
yeah.
those people deluded? Those people that say they have had a religious experience?
I think they are, yes.
Those people who say that we have experienced a miracle, that God has interceded in the world.
So. Yes, most definitely.
That's a delusion.
Yes.
It's not just that God doesn't exist, it's that it's delusional to think so. By contrast, Jordan Peterson has made talking about God cool again. He can't seem to stop talking about God and the biblical narratives. Now, to be clear, Peterson is very cagey about what he exactly believes on matters relating to God. I don't think we have any reason to think he's a historic or orthodox Christian, but he has been wrestling with God, which is the title of his new book. I like Jordan Peterson. I mean, I like Richard Dawkins too, but I listen to Jordan Peterson from time to time, and I suspect he in some ways wrestles more with the idea of God and less with God himself. But that's a topic for a later day, and I, of course, don't know exactly where he's at. I, for one, am thankful he's putting this kind of conversation into the mainstream, and he seems to be on something of a journey. Now, the discussion was moderated by Alex O'Connor, who is a YouTuber with a very large channel. Now, Alex is a sharp guy, and he's often very, very insightful, as we'll actually see here in a moment. While he's solidly in the agnostic atheist camp, he seems to have a kind of openness in a kind of non-new atheist way. And he often, very often, seems to understand some of the issues better than many Christians and other religious folks do. Now, I'm not sure why this conversation needed a moderator, but I suspect it's because Jordan Peterson is apt to go down a path and then lift off into the atmosphere and may never be seen or heard from again. And indeed, it was greatly helpful to have Alex there to bring him back to earth and keep things on track. In the discussion, Dawkins repeatedly stakes out his domain as the domain of facts. He sees science as our primary way of knowing the world. Evidence for him just is the evidence of scientific facts. Whereas Peterson, his concern is symbol, myth, and metaphor.
The facts that I care about are the facts that are true and have evidence going for them. And I'm not that interested in symbols. I think, Dr. Peterson, you're drunk on symbols.
Yes, you mentioned, I've heard that comment, yeah.
Now, by the way, this is why Dawkins is so good. He's so incisive, and he has really mastered the zinger, where he can size up an opponent in a sentence that's, one part humorous and another part stings a lot. He's been doing that kind of thing to Christians and other religious folks for a very long time. But leave it to Alex O'Connor to ask Richard Dawkins perhaps the very most important question for Dawkins to answer.
Professor Dawkins, would you say that underlying the scientific enterprise is a fundamentally unscientific assumption?
This, I think, is an incredibly important question. If your view is that science is the primary way of knowing, and yet science has at bottom an unscientific assumption, then the view is just self-refuting. And that's the worst problem for a view to have. Now, I love Peterson's reaction to this.
Would you say that underlying the scientific enterprise is a fundamentally unscientific assumption? You can make scientific investigations. You can make scientific investigations.
He just went to a very happy place right there and just completely locks in. Okay, Alex goes on.
You can make scientific investigations in the world, but in order to do so, you need to choose what to prioritize. You need to choose what to investigate. You also need to value the truth. You need to have a value and a motivation for doing it in the first place. Those kinds of things cannot themselves be scientifically justified. And so does the scientific enterprise have an unscientific assumption of space?
I suppose it does. I suppose it does. I suppose it does.
Now, unfortunately, we don't get a good explanation how Dawkins reconciles this unjustified assumption.
I think that Jordan prioritizes myth and I prioritize fact. And I think myth is kind of vaguely interesting, but it's not the be-all and end-all of my life. I think it's somewhat secondary to scientific fact, the sort of facts that tell us how old the universe is, how old the world is, the history of life, the engineering achievements of landing a spacecraft on a comet. These are the things that science can do. And as I said, the predictions of quantum theory, to come back to that, the predictions of quantum theory, which are verified to a sufficient number of decimal places that it's equivalent to predicting the width of North America to 1 hair's breadth. Now, that is, however difficult quantum theory is to understand, that is what you can get from quantum theory. Now, the mysteries of the Bible, if they are mysteries, aren't in the same league. I mean, they just don't cut it.
He just chooses to prioritize fact, and for Dawkins, again, this would be the facts known by science. Now, I don't love this already because facts need not be scientific facts. I mean, most philosophers, most thinkers would agree that there are things like logical facts or moral facts, what we might call more generally philosophical facts. But this is emblematic of the same problem. You can assume scientific facts are the facts that exist, but you can't justify that claim scientifically. It's a philosophical claim. If all we have is science, then you can only just assume that this is the case in an unjustified way. Now, I even think there are facts known through myth in a technical sense, and symbol. So if I were Jordan Peterson, I wouldn't accept this dichotomy. It's scientific facts that Dawkins prioritizes, not facts per se. So why does he prioritize scientific facts? Well, it seems from his response, it's because of all the amazing things you can do with science. There is this great pragmatic value, and he sees little pragmatic value in religion. So trying to be as charitable as I can, it seems his response amounts to that science does many things and gets us a lot of amazing things, and it is so very, very precise. So for that reason, it's worth prioritizing even if one must do it in an unjustified way. Now, Jordan Peterson tries his hand at making a similar point. He asks Dawkins for what he sees as the preconditions for the scientific enterprise, and of course gives his thoughts on the matter.
So one of the things that I've tried to study is the preconditions for the scientific enterprise itself. You appeared to agree with Alex that there might be presumptions, axioms that need to be accepted. I don't want to put words in your mouth because I want to get this right before the scientific enterprise can begin. So I've tried to think those through. So let me lay out a couple of them. This is partly what I've done while trying to make the case, for example, that you're more of a Christian than you think you are. So, for example, I think that the scientific enterprise is motivated by the axiomatic presumption that truth tends towards a unity. I think that it's predicated on the notion that there is a logical order that's intrinsic to the cosmos, that that fundamental order is good, that it's intelligible to human beings, and that discovering that order and aligning ourselves with it makes for life more abundant. I think that the scientific enterprise is also predicated on the idea that the truth will set you free. And I think all of those axioms are religious and derived from the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Now, unfortunately, Peterson doesn't stop. He kind of keeps loading up Dawkins with details and further sort of implications of the view, and they really never get back to the point. So we never really get a good answer for how Dawkins sort of understands the preconditions for the scientific enterprise. And this is the point that sometimes you just need to stop and let the person answer the really important question. But this doesn't happen. He keeps loading them up, and then Peterson gets into a very long description of the bronze serpent from Numbers 21, and really the moment just passes. But Dawkins was pressed on this twice, and he seems to affirm that he has an unjustified, at least scientifically unjustified, assumption at the very heart of his epistemology. Philosophers worry about starting places, or what's sometimes called first principles, or you might call these axioms, right? The starting place is in some ways the most important thing to figure out. If you believe something, and if the belief is to be rational, the basis upon which you believe must be rational, and it must provide a solid footing all the way down. If the starting place is bad, then everything downstream from this unjustified assumption becomes problematic as well. So there are two big problems I see here. First is an issue of inconsistency, or maybe an issue of hypocrisy. You know who has made a career out of scolding people for making unjustified assumptions? Well, Richard Dawkins. He's famous for excoriating religious folks who are assuming some religious claim is true. Try telling Richard Dawkins that you believe Christianity is true because the Bible tells you so. And if you really want to see him get excited, tell him you just blindly assume this to be the case. It'd be one thing if he just says, yes, science works, and I don't know why, but I'm glad it does, and that's what I'm all about. But Richard Dawkins is in the worldview game. He has celebrity status precisely for telling people there is no God. In fact, he has said countless times through the years that there's no reason whatsoever to believe in God. But here you go. Here's a really good reason to believe in God. Science works with unbelievable precision. This is itself evidence for theism, and it's certainly not evidence for atheism. And this leads me to the second problem. This is not just an unjustified assumption. It's a downright irrational assumption given his worldview. Again, just to make clear, it's fine for us to sometimes not know and just sort of prioritize things because they work so well. I often say that I don't know much about how an airplane works, but I certainly know that they are amazing and they work well, and I get to where I'm going and I get on them regularly. So let's call this an unjustified assumption. But notice that's just unjustified. It's not irrational. I don't have anything that I believe that flies in the face of the science of flight. Again, my worldview fits rather nicely with it. It's just that I haven't taken the time to understand the science of flight. But that's not Dawkins here. He's an avowed philosophical naturalist, a materialist, and of course an atheist. He thinks there's no design, there's nothing at bottom. He has famously said the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. But that's not true. We observe a universe that is intelligible, where science can achieve these marvels. Albert Einstein once said that the eternal mystery of the world is its comprehensibility. The fact that it is comprehensible is a miracle. The intelligibility of the universe and the fact that through science and technology we can take rocket ships to the moon and accomplish all these incredible feats of human ingenuity counts as a huge problem for Dawkins' naturalistic and atheistic worldview. So it's just not sensible to say, well, it just works, and I just have this unjustified assumption, and also to say there's definitely no God, no designer, that's all just a delusion. If God of a certain sort exists and has the intention for us to subdue the world, well, this would seem to predict an intelligible universe where science can put us, on the moon. If you want to deny this, then you ought to explain how the intelligibility of the universe fits with your worldview. Now, just to be clear, the problem is not prioritizing scientific fact. Many, many Christians have prioritized scientific facts over the years, and they've given us, for example, the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, which has given way to our scientific tradition today. That's not the problem at all. The problem is that Dawkins prioritizes science, affirms philosophical naturalism, and thereby excludes everything else as without value, and is even willing to say those things are delusional. But he prioritizes fact by making irrational assumptions. Now, what I think we see in this brief exchange, but very telling exchange between Richard Dawkins and Jordan Peterson is that there is significant tension between a kind of naturalistic, atheistic worldview and the intelligibility of the universe, which gives way to science itself. And that tension is not easily resolved. Our worldviews should be able to explain something so fundamental as that. Now, I think that this fact points to that the world was created by God, and that God created in such a way that he made the world intelligible, such that we can do science and we can pull off these marvels. Now, if you don't agree with that, that's of course fine, but what you're gonna have to do is explain why the world is intelligible. And if you love science, then it seems to me you should have an explanation for why science works in the first place.